In 1960, Americans across the country saw something for the first time that we now take for granted. A presidential debate. John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon debated each other live on air in an election where the outcome could have been flipped by just over 40,000 votes. There's no doubt that the debates of 1960 influenced the election. Those debates in 1960 were only the first in a series of televised presidential debates. Barring a hiatus between 1960 and 1976, the debates have been an essential part of American presidential elections since then. So, what were the most famous debates since then? And how did they influence American politics? In 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debated each other 7 times during a campaign for a Senate seat. This wasn't a presidential debate, however it did have the effect of making Lincoln nationally famous, and it helped him win the Republican nomination in 1860, then the presidency. During the 1940 presidential election, the Republican challenger, Willkie, challenged FDR to a debate. FDR declined, however, and it took another 20 years for a presidential debate to come to fruition. In those 20 years, though, there were a number of primary debates, that is, debates between candidates fighting for their party's nomination for president. Fast forward to 1960.
The question really is, which candidate and which party will meet the problems that the United States is going to face in the 60s?
During the 1960 presidential election, Kennedy and Nixon held 4 televised debates. These 4 debates were the first presidential debates in American history. Most people can agree on one thing about the first debate. Nixon's appearance during the debate wasn't as good as it could have been. He refused to put on TV makeup. His gray suit didn't stand out against the background when viewed in black and white, and he visibly sweated. Additionally, Nixon was recovering from an infection, and spent the days preceding the debate campaigning vigorously. In contrast, Kennedy was wearing a dark suit, making him stand out from the background. He looked healthy, and he spent the days preceding the debate relaxing and going over debate questions. There's a popular story about this debate. Listeners on radio thought that Nixon won, while viewers on television thought that Kennedy won. For the next 3 debates, however, Nixon learned from his mistake, and he improved his television appearance. Over half the voters in the 1960 election said that they were influenced by the debates in some way. Nixon lost that election in an extremely close race. If just 40,000 voters flipped across a few states, he could have been the 35th president of the United States. After that, there weren't any debates until 1976. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson didn't participate in any, and in 1968 and 72, Nixon refused. In 1976, Gerald Ford, the then president, was behind in the polls to the then governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. He challenged him to debates to try and boost his standing. There were 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. It was during the second presidential debate that President Ford made a grievous error.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
He stated that the Soviet Union was not dominating Eastern Europe. The moderator was visibly taken aback and had to ask for Ford to clarify.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone?
Ford didn't take back his previous comment. Instead, he simply went further, saying that Romania, Yugoslavia, and Poland were not influenced or under pressure by the Soviet Union.
I don't believe, Mr. Franco, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union.
This surprised many people, and after the debate, Ford's poll numbers against Carter fell 4 points. Ford went on to lose the popular vote in the 1976 election by less than 2 points. The 1980 election pitted Jimmy Carter, who incidentally is still alive as of 2022, against Ronald Reagan. There were 2 debates between the presidential candidates. For the first one, the incumbent president, Carter, didn't attend. This was because a third-party candidate, John Anderson, was invited. Carter refused to attend if a third-party candidate was attending. In this first debate, Reagan performed strongly, and Anderson's numbers in the polls dropped. He wasn't invited to the second debate, and the second included both Carter and Reagan. This debate is memorable for Reagan's line, "There you go again."
These are the kind of elements of a national health insurance important to the American people. Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.
This was in response to Carter questioning Reagan about his record on Medicare. Reagan would use this line again in future debates, and even today, politicians occasionally use it. This debate is also memorable for Reagan's closing remarks.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
At the time, the nation was in the middle of a recession, and there was a hostage crisis in Iran. Reagan won that election in an electoral landslide. However, he didn't stop there. In the 1984 election, Reagan was president, and after a brief period where his poll numbers dropped, he was an extremely popular president. The economy was doing great, and Reagan's nickname as the Great Communicator wasn't just a fluke. He truly was a great communicator. The Democratic challenger to the 1984 election was Walter Mondale, who served as vice president under Jimmy Carter. As before, there were 2 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. Reagan even used his "there you go again" line again.
You know, I wasn't going to say this at all, but I can't help it. There you go again.
However, also during the debate, this was the first one, Reagan often seemed confused, and viewers were questioning his fitness for president. Why? Well, at the time, Reagan was already the oldest president in American history, 73 to be exact. People were wondering if he simply had the stamina to go on for another 4 years. For reference, in the 2020 election, Trump was 74 years old and Biden was 77. During the second debate, when asked about precisely this, his age, Reagan responded with a joke that seemed to get rid of any doubts regarding his age.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan went on to win the election in the biggest electoral landslide in history. The only state that Reagan lost was Mondale's home state of Minnesota, and even there, Reagan lost by less than 4,000 votes. In 1988, the debates weren't very memorable, especially compared to the 2 elections surrounding it. George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, was running against Michael Dukakis. Bush was ahead in the polls thanks to his vice presidency under Reagan and the economy's strength under him. Apart from one notable moment where Bush questioned Dukakis about the death penalty, the most famous part came during the sole vice presidential debate when Dukakis' running mate, Senator Lloyd Bentsen, responded to Bush's running mate, Dan Quayle, when he compared his length of service in Congress to JFK's.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson?
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That wasn't enough to save the Democratic ticket, however, and in the 1988 election, the Bush-Quayle ticket won 40 out of the 50 states in DC. After that, there was the 1992 election. There were 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. The presidential debates were different this time in that there was a third-party candidate who joined, Ross Perot. Perot joined Bush and Bill Clinton on the debate stage. Perot generally did well in debates, though it wasn't enough to hand him the presidency. However, perhaps the most notable moment of the debates was when Bush was checking his watch during a question on how the national debt affected him personally. This led to many Americans perceiving Bush as out of touch with the average American, and Bush lost the election to Clinton in an electoral landslide. The 1996 election and its debates weren't that notable. Democrat Bill Clinton was running against Republican Bob Dole, but Clinton was going to win either way. Much like Reagan 12 years earlier, Clinton was an incumbent president when the economy was strong. There were 2 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. There weren't any famous lines from the debate that are remembered or that influenced the election in any significant way. Clinton went on to win by almost 9 points in the popular vote, while winning 379 electoral votes. The next election was the 2000 election. There were 3 presidential debates, as well as 1 vice presidential debate. George W. Bush, the aforementioned George H.W. Bush's son, was running against Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States of America. The first debate is probably most famous for Gore saying lockbox 7 times. Saturday Night Live made a parody of this debate, and Ted Levine, one of Gore's senior advisors, said that, quote, "If Gore had won that debate clearly and decisively, he would have been president." The second and third debates also helped Bush. This election was a really close one. Bush lost the popular vote, but due to his 537 vote margin in Florida, he became the 43rd president of the United States. After this debate, things kind of became normalized. There weren't any particularly famous lines that are remembered today, and things settled into a routine. With the exception of 2020, when Trump got the coronavirus, there have been 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. It's become a kind of routine now, and debates are taken for granted these days. America was one of the first countries to have a debate between presidential candidates, or any candidates to lead a country. Canada held their first debate in 1968, and Germany has had debates between party leaders since 1969. In the past decade, various countries started having debates between the people who wanted to lead their country, be it as president or as prime minister. Britain, Brazil, Australia, and Portugal all started having debates between their prospective leaders during the 2010s. So, that's the history of American presidential debates. If you liked the video, then be sure to subscribe and like. Thank you for watching Explained. New videos every other Friday.